Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're going to wait a few more minutes so everyone can trickle into the Zoom. Okay, welcome to another of our series of virtual book talks on Bronx history. In this talk, we're going a little further afield to Long Island and New York, but the Bronx will also be discussed. I'm Roger McCormack, the Director of Education here at the Bronx County Historical Society, and it's my pleasure to introduce Mark Torres, who will be talking about his book, Long Island and the Legacy of Eugenics, Station of Intolerance. Mark Torres is the author of Long Island Migrant Labor Camps, Dust for Blood, two crime novels, A Stirring in the North Fork, and Adeline, and a labor union-related children's book titled Good Guy Jake. Mark is also a labor and employment attorney who tirelessly represents thousands of unionized workers and their families throughout the greater New York area. His commitment to the labor movement spans more than 30 years. Mark has a law degree from Fordham University School of Law and a bachelor's degree in history from New York University. He is currently an adjunct professor of labor studies at Hofstra University. All right, Mark, take it away, and thank you so much for doing this again. Very interesting talk, I think.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining this evening to hear me discuss my book, Long Island and the Legacy of Eugenics, Station of Intolerance, which was released on January 21st of this year. So I suppose if I asked each one of you in attendance tonight what you may know of eugenics, I'm sure I would get mixed answers. It's certainly been written about by many authors and historians, but it's never been told from a truly local perspective. And since the global headquarters of eugenics was on Long Island, Cold Spring Harbor specifically, a telling of this history from the local perspective was both critical and necessary. And I'm proud to say that this is the first book to do so. As an author and historian, a large part of my work is spent on research, understanding and familiarizing myself with the information so I could retell it in an explanatory way. And that took me to many places, including Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory and Archives, the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, the Truman State University in Missouri, and many other locations. And through my research, I scoured thousands of documents, articles, photographs, personal correspondence, books, and documentaries. It certainly was a long process, but a necessary one. So, eugenics was originally conceived in England in the 19th century. It was based on a theory that the best traits in humans can be engineered, sort of like breeding racehorses or growing flowers. Now, it was not a new idea at the time because the quest to improve humanity was mentioned in ancient Greek, Roman, and Sanskrit writings. And I suppose the idea of rooting out illness, disease, disability, deformity is a great aspirational goal. And I'm sure if we asked anyone, they would sign up for that. Problem is, though, how or if we as human beings can reach that goal. Now, among the founding fathers, so-called founding fathers of eugenics, certainly the leading one was Sir Francis Galton, the cousin of Charles Darwin. He was widely known as the founding father of eugenics. He actually named eugenics combining the words, which really meant well-born. Galton he developed the first weather maps. He developed the use of fingerprints in forensic criminology. And he was obsessed with patterns and statistics. And his motto was, wherever you can, count. Among the other so-called founding fathers was a man named Thomas Malthus, an English economist who argued for strict population control. He believed that with the size of the planet, there's only so many people that could comfortably live on it. And also a man named Johann Gregor Mendel, who was an Austrian biologist who experimented with the hereditary traits of pea plants. So when you think of eugenics, there's generally two strains. Positive eugenics, what I mentioned earlier, the aspirational theory that we could be perfect and root out illness and deformity and disease. But the negative eugenics, which by and large was the greatest problem with this pseudoscience overall, it was the idea to prevent those with so-called bad traits from having children and ultimately sought to eliminate them. This included the poor, the mentally and physically disabled, morally undesirable citizens. And to quote historian Nathaniel Comfort, the problem with utopias is that they establish a set of aspirations that then blind you to a certain set of consequences, and that can be dangerous. Now, scientists did not really understand, really crack the gene code, if you will, until the mid 1960s. So eugenics was largely based on assumptions. Currently, the scientific method of research is the case where scientists test a theory, they ask questions, conduct experiments, they either prove or disprove that theory. Eugenicists practice this in reverse. They already had a preconceived notion of heredity, which was premised on classist and racist beliefs. And then they would seek to amass the data to support that theory. For instance, if you had a poor married couple, if the husband was a thief and the wife was an alcoholic, eugenicists would theorize that they would have bad genetic inheritable traits that would automatically be passed on to their children. Of course, this ignored any legitimate factors that could have led to the problems in their lives. But again, it showed the true assumptive nature of what eugenics was as a science or pseudoscience. Today, well, people use words like moron, idiot, imbecile as common insults, but over a century ago, these were used as medical diagnoses. And you see here in the photo the sliding scale from idiot up to moron. And again, collectively, these terms were often known as what's called feeble-minded. It was a catch-all diagnosis that combined mental deficiency with immorality. All people labeled with these diagnoses were subjected to harsh eugenic measures. Now, although eugenics was theorized in England, make no mistake, the true practice of eugenics was developed right here in America, largely by one man, Charles Benedict Davenport, who was the true architect of the American eugenics program. Born in Connecticut, he lived on Long Island for his life, and he was a Harvard-educated biologist and teacher. Now, he was no ordinary biologist. He was a renowned biologist, known for making a leading biologist in an era where biology made phenomenal advancements for mankind. He was a true leader of the science at the time. Now, Davenport was influenced by Mendel's hereditary work on pea plants and Galton's statistical mind of counting. His goal was to prove that heredity worked in the same way in humans as it did with animals, and he described eugenics as the science of human improvement by better breeding. He believed the U.S. was destined to become a pure master race, and he argued that eugenics was the only way to reach that goal. In 1902, Davenport, along with his wife Gertrude, went on a boat, took a trip to London, to England, and he met Galton there. And the purpose of that was to gain his endorsement for the American eugenics program. And we know the records show that he did get that endorsement by way of a glowing letter that Galton wrote on behalf of Davenport. And Davenport came back to America furnished with this letter, ready to engage in this program. Harry Hamilton Laughlin, born in Iowa, and was a Princeton-educated biologist. He served as the superintendent of the Eugenics Record Office from 1910 to 1939. He essentially was second in command behind Charles Davenport. He worked closely with the U.S. Congress to pass strict immigration laws in the name of eugenics. He also developed the blueprint for eugenic sterilization laws across the United States. And during this presentation, you're going to hear eugenic sterilizations. And make no mistake, what that meant, what that was forced sterilization. Women and men were forced to be sterilized against their will in the name of eugenics. Henry Herbert Goddard, born in Maine, a mathematician and psychologist. He was the director of the New Jersey Training School for Feeble-Minded Children at Vineland, New Jersey. Now, Davenport and Goddard both devised the term feeble-minded, which again combined mental deficiency and immorality. It was a catch-all term that labeled millions of people in the name of eugenics. Goddard also developed the English version of the IQ test, which was used widely by eugenicists throughout the world. In fact, in May of 1917, Goddard's test, the IQ test, was used to test 1.7 million Army recruits at military bases across the United States. Based on their findings, more than half of those groups were declared, quote, morons. Now, eugenicists pounced on this and said, and suggested this is the danger we have as a nation. We need to fix this. These are the problems. This is why eugenics was needed. However, these IQ tests were notoriously vague and certainly biased. Many of these soldiers were farm boys from the Midwest who never had any schooling, but many of the questions that were asked on the test were questions about technological questions about automobiles and fine art, two things they would not have any knowledge of. And when they got those answers wrong, as they typically did, it was used against them to determine their, quote, level of intelligence. Mary Harriman, born in Rochester, New York, the widow of Mr. E.H. Harriman, a wealthy railway mogul who donated upstate New York's where Harriman State Park is. Upon his death, Mrs. Harriman inherited $100 million. Today's money, that's $3.7 billion. Staggeringly wealthy woman. She was a staunch eugenicist and close ally with Davenport, and she lent financial support to him and the eugenic program. She actually bought an 80-acre tract of land at Cold Spring Harbor and paid for the construction of the eugenics record office. And of course, the Carnegie Foundation, established in Washington, D.C. in 1902 to, quote, encourage investigation, research, and discovery. The Carnegie Institute provided lucrative resources and funding for the eugenics programs in America and later in Nazi Germany. And if you think of tracking Davenport's plan here, again, he was the true architect. He first meets with Galton in 1902, gets his endorsement. He brings on Harry Laughlin as second in command. Henry Goddard helps him expand eugenic diagnoses and IQ tests. And he received lucrative funding from Mary Harriman, the Carnegie Institute, the Rockefellers, and many others for the time. At that point, the American eugenics program was launched. Now, if you remember nothing else from this program, I would urge you to remember this. Eugenics was not a fringe movement. It was embraced widely throughout the world. It truly was, as I called it, the rage of the age. Eugenics was taught in nearly 300 colleges across the United States, including Harvard, Yale, NYU, and other Ivy League schools. It was embraced by the medical profession by doctors and scientists. It was openly supported by every president from Theodore Roosevelt to Herbert Hoover. Even in religion, many religions had eugenic essay sermon contests. They would vie for the best sermons in the name of eugenics. Many books were written about it, both scholarly and for entertainment. And it was embraced in popular culture, movies, commercial advertisements. It was inescapable. Eugenics had this ability to infiltrate and run in tandem with many movements of the time, including birth control, vision, and so forth. And among the many prominent people that were eugenicists that may surprise you were Alexander Graham Bell, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Helen Keller, who was a strong eugenicist as well. Margaret Sanger, the leader of the American birth control movement. She was no doubt a strong supporter of eugenics, and she had written many books, many of them extremely racist in its content, including The Pivot of Civilization. Now, what was interesting with Sanger was that although she was a eugenicist, she believed in total population control, like Thomas Malthus had theorized many centuries earlier. Yet, so her position was sterilize across the board, where eugenicists would say, hold off, we'll only sterilize the poor, the inferior classes, but leave the wealthy, the elites, leave them alone. And that really kept the divide between Sanger and the eugenicists in terms of merging their movements together. But nonetheless, Margaret Sanger and many others were staunch eugenicists at the time. The Black Stork, a hugely popular eugenic film released in 1917. It features a doctor who counsels a fictionalized couple to not have a child because the child would likely be, quote, defective. This film ran in theaters for 10 consecutive years. Eugenics also had a wide international exposure. In the Panama Pacific International Expo in San Francisco in 1915, this exhibit was visited by 18 million people over a 9-month period. And in the Midwest, there were fitter family contests and eugenic health exhibits where families would vie for the best eugenic families in the area. There were many awards and trophies given, and it was really fiercely competitive. And a lot of this was really targeted in the Midwest because of their connection with farming and breeding. They wanted to have eugenics ingrained into that way of life. Now, aside from the theories, the book really delves into the practice of eugenics. What did they do? And to look at that, you have to start at the basics. It started at Cold Spring Harbor on the North Shore of Long Island, a former whaling port lush with flora and fauna for scientific research. In 1890, the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences opened a state-of-the-art biology lab to study birds, plants, insects, goats, cats, and so forth. In 1898, Davenport was appointed the director of that program. 2 years later, in 1904, the Carnegie Institute leased a 10-acre tract of land and opened the Carnegie Station for Experimental Evolution. Davenport was appointed to run this and the entire program. And at a press release, he really didn't hide what his intentions were when he stated, the problem of the origin of species has taken quite a new form in the half century since Darwin's epic work appeared. The work of the station is not therefore to confirm Darwin, but to go much farther than Darwin did. And he certainly did that, as you'll soon see. Opening in 1910, the Eugenics Record Office was opened at Cold Spring Harbor, again in the direction of Charles Davenport. It received lucrative funding and was constructed with the money from Mary Harriman, and it served just under 3 decades as really the headquarters, the de facto headquarters of the American eugenics program. The work, I will submit to you, the work conducted at this small, unassuming building had a direct and negative impact on human history throughout the 20th century and beyond. The Eugenics Record Office was essentially a hub for data collection. Millions of index cards, family charts, and other documents were stored in special fireproof cabinets at the ERO. The data was used to support eugenics as a science and amplify its movement. The ERO had a publication called Eugenical News, which is essentially a gathering of all eugenical information from around the globe and published in a quarterly periodical and then resent out for wide distribution. It was one of the most uh, durable things that the ERO was able to accomplish to constantly propagandize and get this information out. Now, the ERO developed a robust training program for eugenic field workers who, by the way, were mostly female and college educated, many of whom graduated from Cornell, Vassar, Wellesley, upstate colleges. Between 1911 and 1924, there was an estimated 250 field workers hired for this job. They were paid $75 a month, and they had to commit to a minimum of 1 year of work in the field. They would travel the country to interview families, patients, prisoners, etc., with biased questionnaires aimed at labeling them as socially defective. And all records were brought back and stored at the ERO. So you have a plan in place. We have this movement, this rage of the age, and everybody's in on eugenics. But what was the plot? What was the plan? Well, we know because the eugenicists told us. Beginning in 1911, members of the eugenics section of the American Breeders Association met at the historic City Club on 45th Street in New York City. Charles Davenport, Harry Laughlin, and prominent doctors, scientists, and leading thinkers and professionals of the time gathered here for several meetings throughout the next couple of years to discuss their eugenic goals. And we know what their goals were because, again, they've reduced it to writing. And the committee drafted a report authored by Harry Laughlin, which discussed the best ways to deal with 10% of the U.S. population, 15 million Americans, who they deemed were socially defective. They had a name for them. They called them the submerged 10th. And a 10-part plan was included in this document, which included life segregation, basically locking people up in mental institutions during their breeding years, marriage restriction, forced sterilization, and yes, mass murder. They contemplated killing 15 million Americans by as early as 1914 in this country. Now, you may wonder who are the groups targeted. Well, again, we know because the records tell us that there were 10 groups listed, and the first was the feeble-minded, which again was a catch-all phrase to ensnare anybody who may, to them, have seemed a little off. 2, the poor. 3, alcoholics. 4, criminals of any kind. 5, epileptics. 6, the insane. 7, the physically weak class. 8, those prone to specific diseases. 9, the deformed. And 10, those with defective sensory organs, the blind, deaf, and mute, which makes the idea that Helen Keller was a eugenicist quite the more shocking that her group was on this list. With the plan in place, then the eugenicists went out to hunt. They hunted the so-called submerged tent, and to do so, they visited many places throughout New York and the nation. They visited mental asylums, prisons, poorhouses, Native American tribal lands, poor rural areas, and even the Coney Island circus shows, the so-called freak shows. Now, Davenport, you may ask, how did they get access to all of these types of facilities? Well, for one, Davenport was a revered scientist. He forged strong relationships with many of the people who ran these facilities, who, by the way, were also eugenicists. So it was an easy way to get in. Of course, there was a pre-days before the HIPAA laws. They had access to the patients, the records, everything they needed at will. In fact, Davenport once wrote to the American Museum of Natural History to request 2 skulls of Shinnecock Indians that they had in their records. And sure enough, they supplied that. They answered his request and sent that to him. And again, the question is why? To identify, target, and eliminate the socially defective class. Some of the places included Pilgrim State in Brentwood, New York, and Long Island, the State Custodial Institution in Rome, New York, where almost all of the eugenic sterilizations were conducted in New York from 1912 to 1920. Specifically in the Bronx, Union Hospital, there's some records indicating that eugenics was practiced there and likely was. And even Hart Island, although there's no records to directly link the eugenics being practiced on Hart Island, certainly many of the bodies there that were buried there came from many of these facilities, and the connections were certainly run deep on onto that. Here's a photograph of Kings Park on Long Island, the shores of the Long Island Sound. It was in operation from 1885 to 1993. Had over 150 buildings with almost over 9,000 patients. Self-sufficient with livestock, fire station, power plant, maintenance buildings, and even its own railroad station. Here, again, like the others, eugenicists were given full access to study the patients and their records. Essentially, these were captive populations. It was easy for eugenicists to go here and gather data for almost 10,000 people in one shot. And that's exactly how they were able to build up the data and continue to buoy up the burgeoning so-called science. Coney Island circus sideshows, the so-called freak shows. Late in the 19th century, these were home to very popular shows. Of course, many of these performers were exploited, but many of them also lived a quite lucrative lifestyle. They made a lot of money doing it, knowing that the conditions they had were perfectly legitimate. The man in the right, upper right corner. Um, Lionel, the half man, half lion. In reality, he had hypertrichosis, a condition which produced excessive facial and body hair, leaving him looking like a half man, half lion. The man on the left, Tony, the alligator skin boy, he had a condition called ichthyosis, a condition which leaves tough rectangular scales on the body. Eugenicists would come here and they would pounce. They would alarm the public and say, this, without eugenics, we will all become a variation of this or worse. Again, the fear mongering was prominent, and this was an era where there was little access to legitimate data to either to check and see if it's verifying what they're saying is true. Letchworth Village up in Rockland County. It was operation from 1911 to 1996. Davenport himself spent a lot of time at this facility. He studied children and adults. And in fact, in August of 1929, Davenport and two doctors castrated a 13-year-old boy with Down syndrome. They wanted to study the tissue for eugenic purposes, which of course were inconclusive, leaving the boy, without a testicle. And the boy's mother, who was also disabled, this likely led to serious questions about whether they had proper consent to perform this procedure, and I would feign to suggest that they did not. Eugenicists, they also created these elaborate charts and pedigree and family tree charts. And here's the near kin of Theodore Roosevelt, who they would tout as the good genes. This is what we all should have and strive for. And they would use this data in a positive way. And to the contrary, they would look for negative data, like the photograph on the left. 4 generations in one almshouse at one time at Yaphank, New York, and Long Island. There's 4 women there, and one of them holding a child. And on the right, the hereditary predisposition to mental illness. Again, meant to alarm the public, scare the public, and suggest this is what is needed. Eugenics is what's needed to save us from all of these calamities. They also used elaborate tools and devices. On the left, an abacus to determine the structure of human chromosomes. And on the right, it's a device called the mechanism of Mendelian heredity to show how chromosomes carry gene traits. The more elaborate, the more sophisticated, the more legitimized the science was. Here's a report, The Crime and Race Descent in 1920. It's meant to show the racial profiles of U.S. prisoners in comparison to other prisoners in other countries. Now, eugenics, one of the largest goals of eugenics was to help influence national policy. And starting on really the smaller scale was marriage restriction laws. Several states passed these laws restricting people with physical and mental disabilities from getting married. The laws encouraged others to report their fellow citizens. In Virginia, the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 was passed with a staunch eugenicist named Walter Plecker. His efforts led to the passage of this law, and the law prohibited marriage of any white person to another person with even, quote, 1 drop of non-Caucasian blood. Violators of the law face fines, imprisonment, and nullified marriages. Immigration restriction was one of the most important movements that eugenicists sought to infiltrate. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 20 million immigrants came to the U.S., 8 million alone between 1900 and 1909. Harry Laughlin was enlisted as a eugenics expert by Congress to make presentations largely racist and xenophobic, and that led to the passage of the Emergency Immigration Restriction Act of 1921. This cut immigration from Southern and Eastern European countries by nearly 2/3. 3 years later, the Immigration Act of 1924 was passed on the same principles, and it restricted access to many European countries to as low as 3%. Although it couldn't be verified, there is indications that Otto Frank and his family, among millions of others, were caught up in these kind of restrictions that denied them the ability to escape their fate. Now, The anti-immigration movement at the time was led by a man named Madison Grant, a lawyer, author, conservationist, and zoologist. Now, Grant was a notoriously racist. He wrote a book called The Passing of the Great Race in 1916. He believed in his book that whites were the master race facing extinction, and he openly criticized and complained about all races entering the U.S., including Jews, Italians, Polish, Irish, and so forth. Hitler read this book while he was in prison, and he called it, quote, his Bible. Now, Grant was responsible for creating the term the Nordic race, much like the Nazis later would use the Aryan race. These were fictionalized races to indicate what they felt was the best version of the white race. Grant was a staunch eugenicist and aligned closely with the ERO. And in 1920, Davenport wrote a letter to Grant stating, quote, can we build a wall high enough around this country to keep out these cheaper races? This was in 1920. Of course, one of the ultimate goals of eugenicists was mass sterilization. They believed it was the fastest, cheapest, surest way to control the defective population. Sterilize them. Don't let them have any more children. As of January 1921, there were just over 3,000 eugenical sterilizations performed in 15 states that had these laws, led largely by California, but also others, Nebraska, Oregon, Indiana, Wisconsin, and New York. But for eugenicists, this was too slow. They wanted to speed it up. So in 1922, Harry Laughlin wrote a book entitled Eugenical Sterilization in the United States. It was essentially a model sterilization law that other states can virtually copy and then look to pass in their own states where they could sterilize people against their will. But even still, a lot of these laws are being struck down by the courts for being unconstitutional. So what eugenicists needed was a test case, something that could be brought up to the highest court of the land, the U.S. Supreme Court, to survive scrutiny and then allow them to really sterilize in mass. Enter Carrie Buck, a young woman born in Charlottesville, Virginia, to a poor family that was forced to place her into foster care. In 1924, she got pregnant out of wedlock. That's really being too generous. She was essentially raped, and her foster parents had her committed to the Virginia colony for epileptics and feeble-minded. A short time later, Carrie gave birth to a daughter named Vivian. Now, the colony that was holding her believed that Carrie, her mother Emma, and her daughter Vivian, who was only 8 months at the time, that they were all feeble-minded and that they wanted to sterilize Carrie. This became their test case for the constitutionality of the eugenic sterilization law, which become known as the Buck v. Bell case. Now, prior to the case, they contacted the ERO for assistance. Harry Laughlin could not attend the trial in person, but he helped them by preparing for the trial and providing written testimony that was submitted freely into evidence against Carrie. Now, although he never met Carrie or Emma, her mother, Laughlin swore under oath that they were both feeble-minded. He also dispatched a man named Arthur Estabrook, a researcher from the ERO, to testify as an expert witness. And although he never met Vivian Buck, who, again, was, mind you, was 8 months old, he testified that she, too, was feeble-minded. So you have the daughter, the mother, and her mother, 3 generations, all feeble-minded. Laughlin also assisted in drafting the appeals for the later court cases. On November 18, 1924, Carrie's first trial began. Irving Whitehead was a court-appointed lawyer. Now, I'm an attorney myself. If I did any of parts of all of these items, I would and should have been disbarred. But nothing happened, and this is what Irving Whitehead did, even though he was Carrie's lawyer. He failed to object or challenge any evidence submitted against her. His questions assisted the case against his own client, and he had a relationship with the state's attorneys without disclosing it. As a result, all of the evidence went in damning Carrie, and in February of 1925, the lower court ruled that yes, the colony could sterilize Carrie, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was to kick it up to appeal and get it up to the Supreme Court, which they did in the second appeal. But when you have a case going on appeal, all the facts and evidence submitted is deemed factual. There is no contesting the facts at that level. It is only a question of law. So in spring of the 1927, the case was finally brought before the United States Supreme Court. And in an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that the state of Virginia could sterilize Carrie Buck against her will based upon eugenics. This decision has never been reversed. To quote one of the latter paragraphs of the merely 5-paragraph decision written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes for the Supreme Court, he stated, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for their crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Now, it's interesting, this court, later, Justice Holmes told a friend that the Buck v. Bell case was, quote, one decision that I wrote that gave me pleasure. And it's interesting how he references Carrie as imbeciles, or Carrie, her mother and daughter. Um, but in reality, Carrie was declared a middle grade moron by the colony. Now, we may quibble over whether that's a distinction, but in that time, it was a very large distinction. A middle grade moron and imbecile were quite different in terms of the eugenic diagnoses, but it didn't matter. Supreme Court wanted to rule as they did rule. And also, you note the 3 generations comment. If you remember the few slides before in Yaphank, New York, and Long Island, they reference to 4 generations in one time in one almshouse. There's no coincidence that this language and verbiage was used, because during the appeals getting up to the High Court, Harry Laughlin and members of the ERO really helped orchestrate that language to get to the Supreme Court. On October 19th, 1927, Carrie Buck was sterilized. She was 21 years old. A few years later, her daughter Vivian tragically died from an intestinal infection following the measles. Now, prior to Buck v. Bell, there were just over 3,000 eugenical sterilizations performed. After Buck v. Bell, from the 30s to the 60s, there were more than 60,000 eugenical sterilizations in the U.S., the largest numbers by far in California, North Carolina, and Virginia. On tribal lands, between 25% and 50% of Native American women were sterilized. In Puerto Rico, up to 20,000 women in one town alone were sterilized, and by 1965, 1/3 of the women on the island between the ages of 25 and 49 were sterilized, all based upon eugenic principles. How far does this go? Well, in November of 1915, a woman gave birth in Chicago hospital to a child with deformity and extreme abnormalities. The chief surgeon, Harry Hazelton, was summoned. He saw the child, he refused to treat the child, and he purposely let the child die. He was brought up by a medical panel for review. He was cleared of wrongdoing. And he and his cohorts celebrated the decision to let the child die and went on a national tour to promote eugenics. His story partly inspired that movie, The Black Stork. The Illinois Institution for Feeble-Minded. Here at this facility, windows are purposely left open and without screens so patients would face cold drafts in the winter and swarming insects in the warm weather. Patients here were reportedly given milk from cows that were infected with tuberculosis. Studies showed that death rate was high as 30%. And the man on the right, U.S. Judge Harry Olson, condemned many patients regularly to this facility. He was a known eugenicist. He was the president of the Eugenic Research Association, and he helped publish Harry Laughlin's book, Eugenical Sterilization in the United States. I would submit to you tonight that this was truly killing in the name of eugenics. Now, the ERO, we talk a lot about the national and local levels, but the EROs continue to spread eugenics all over the globe. Belgium, Canada, Denmark, England, Finland, France, Italy, Norway, Romania, Sweden, and Switzerland all adopted eugenic policies and engaged in mass sterilizations. In 1929, Davenport led a delegation of eugenicists from all over the world in Mussolini-controlled Rome. And they had this big meeting, and at this meeting, and we know the records show this, they created a world atlas. Each country, each delegate was asked to identify the areas where the most defectives were, and again, the goal was to target and eliminate them from each country. These men were truly playing God. Now in America, there were some guardrails. Constitution provided some guardrails to prevent the ultimate atrocities that were certainly contemplated by the eugenicists. But in Nazi Germany, there was no restraint. Hitler himself was avid about eugenics, and although he once told a confidant that if his mother was given a eugenic questionnaire, he was pretty sure that he wouldn't have even been born, meaning she would have been sterilized. Even he understood the fallacies and complexities and falsehoods of eugenics, but of course, nevertheless, went along with it. Now, the American and German eugenic programs were closely aligned. The German eugenic program was led by a man named Otto von Verscher, the director of the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Race Hygiene in Frankfurt, Germany. In 1934, Verscher's work was cited by the American Medical Association, and he was lauded by American scientists and eugenicists for his work. He was closely connected with Charles Davenport and the ERO. He joined the advisory board of Eugenical News, And Davenport once arranged for a delegation of Nazi eugenicists to attend Harvard's 300th anniversary in 1936. Now, Verscher was, like Davenport, was eager to expand his work on eugenics. And in 1934, 56,000 German citizens were sterilized, eugenically sterilized from a law that targeted as many as 400,000 citizens. In 1935, Verscher hired a young assistant to help him carry on his work. The name of that young assistant was Joseph Mengele, who was later became known as the Angel of Death. In 1943, Verscher sent Mengele to Auschwitz, and some of his gruesome acts include: he sewed the wrists and backs of twin boys to simulate Siamese twins. He killed people and performed immediate autopsies, quote, while the bodies were still warm. He removed the patient's stomach without anesthesia. He dissected body parts and sent them back to Verscher for further study marked as, quote, urgent national defense. And he injected dye into the eyes of children, usually twins, and usually leaving them blind. Now, in the summer of 1936, the Heidelberg University in Germany School of Medicine was celebrating its 550th anniversary. Carl Schneider, the dean at the school at the time, awarded Harry Laughlin of the ERO with an honorary degree for his work on eugenics. Laughlin was called one of the most important pioneers in the field of racial hygiene. I'll draw your attention on this photograph on this to the upper right corner with the postage stamp with the Nazi swastika. And on the middle of it, you see addressed to Cold Spring Harbor, Dr. Laughlin. Now, and clearly one of the most direct links between the two programs. Now, just 3 years after this, Laughlin was bestowed with this award, Schneider himself served as a lead researcher to help organize and carry out the infamous Nazi T4 program. This program, they used carbon monoxide at various killing centers throughout Germany and occupied parts of Germany to lethally gas 70,000 German men, women, and children who were disabled or defective citizens. These were German citizens. This is pre-Holocaust. This is on their own people, again, based on eugenics. The victims were herded into large gas chambers and disguised as showers, and ashes and fake birth certificates were later sent to the family saying they died tragically of some experiment gone wrong. This event has been often called the first Nazi genocide, and it certainly served as a template for the Holocaust, and it all has ties to eugenics. After the war, in November of 1946, the doctor's trial in Nuremberg took place. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal doctor, and 22 other Nazi doctors stood trial for crimes against humanity. In their defense, they stated that they were directly inspired by the American eugenics program. They argued that in America, Buck v. Bell case was ruled by the leading court of the land, the Supreme Court of the United States, that allowed forced sterilization of people. They also cited Laughlin's report that called for mass sterilization and euthanasia of up to 15 million Americans, essentially arguing, what do we do different than the eugenicists in American soil, well, at least planned and partly carried out. Now, Brandt and 6 others were convicted and hanged for their crimes, but both Mengele and Verscher never faced justice. What was it all for? Well, the Carnegie Institute, which funded the program for decades, could no longer ignore the ongoing atrocities. In January of 1939, the Institute sent a committee to review the millions of records stored at the ERO and determined that they were sloppily recorded by untrained persons and rendered, quote, worthless for genetic study. Eugenics was deemed as speculative and not a true science. On December 1st of 1939, the ERO was officially closed and all references to eugenics were permanently changed to genetics. The ERO was in operation for just under 3 decades, but its policies lasted far longer than that. Now, by this time, Davenport himself had retired in 1934. He died 10 years later from a bronchial infection while conducting research on the shores of Long Island. Harry Laughlin himself, although he lobbied to continue with the program, it was shut down. He retired and he died in 1943 at 63 years old. Among the many things Laughlin did, and there were many, for eugenics, he specialized in rooting out epilepsy. It was later discovered that Harry Laughlin himself was an epileptic, a fact that he had long kept a secret. In the summer of 2020, Eric Isaacs, the president of the Carnegie Institute, issued the following statement, which dropped overnight anonymously on the website, and it stated this: there is no excuse then or now for our institution's previous willingness to empower researchers who sought to pervert scientific inquiry to justify their own racist and ableist prejudices. Our support of eugenics made us complicit in driving decades of brutal and unconscionable actions by governments in the United States and around the world. As the president of the Carnegie Institute for Science, I want to express my sincere and profound apologies for this organization's past involvement in these horrific pseudoscientific activities. California, North Carolina, and Virginia later passed reparations bills in their states to pay victims who were sterilized, but many had, at that point had already passed away. Eugenics certainly has left a long-standing legacy. In 2002, the Netherlands became the first country to allow doctors to euthanize patients with incurable illnesses. To date, nearly 60,000 people have been euthanized. A 2022 report shows that there are 31 states in the U.S. that still allow for forced sterilizations of people with disabilities, including California, Florida, New York, and D.C. U.S. prison systems have been offering reduced sentencing if inmates agree to be sterilized. In 2023, the FDA began to review new technology that can produce artificial wombs for human beings who want to really, quote, have perfect babies. Some international companies have developed artificial growth pods to stimulate a womb, which can be monitored with smartphone technology. I make no judgment on the legitimacy or need for this technology, but understanding the history of eugenics as I do, there is certainly a cause for concern. Eugenics possessed all the trappings of science, but it was nothing more than a social philosophy driven by racist and classist ideals, which were used to brand, condemn, and eliminate the poor, diseased, disabled, and less fortunate from our society. No one is perfect. We each have our strengths and weaknesses. We all bring something of value to humanity. Collectively, that is what makes human beings special, and eugenicists could never accept this premise. Again, the book is Long Island and the Legacy of Eugenics, Station of Intolerance. You find more information on my website, marktorresauthor.com, and I am here to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mark. That was really shocking, but very interesting talk. And and these ideas obviously have a long and unsavory history. And I was thinking when you were talking about Madison Grant and today Rene Camus and the Great Replacement theory, and that these ideas seemingly come back generations later. So let me turn it over to the audience. M. Petretti says you can't locate your books in the New York Public Library system. The two Long Island books would be worthwhile to be held in its collection. I hope other libraries would be interested. And then she asks, in Buck v. Bell, who was the one Supreme Court dissenter?
Great question. Thank you for asking. The one dissenting judge was the only Catholic judge on the bench. The Catholic religion, by and large, were the most vociferous against eugenics. But by and large, that was the minority of the group. Eugenics was the rage of the age. It was widely espoused and embraced, and people really bought into it. But that was the lone dissenting judge who was the Catholic on the bench.
Tanya Hutchins would like to know, has the Carnegie family commented on this topic and its history of involvement?
Yeah. Hi, Tanya. Thanks for joining tonight. Other than that innocuous apology dropped overnight, there was no public announcements, nothing further. I've reached out to them. I've reached out to the American Genetics Association. I've reached out to anyone who'll hear me to see if they want to not hide from this history, to embrace it so we learn from it. So far, I've been met with silence. But the short answer is no. There's been no other further comment. They must feel they've done enough. And I mean, we could argue, well, they apologized. Obviously, way too little, too late. Certainly unleashed, a dangerous situation on humanity.
And this went on like well into the 1970s, right?
Well,
So,
yeah, eugenics kind of went underground after at the closing of the ERO. The World War II was going on. Everybody wanted to, buckle down. It kind of resurfaced in the 60s. There was this population boom fear again, and Nixon appointed, of all people, John Rockefeller, who was also a staunch eugenicist, to oversee that program. And then many of the sterilizations went on after. That's correct. In the 70s, in California, North Carolina, Virginia, and other states, it may have just changed the name, but the principles were there. The idea of eliminating the wrong people from having children. In their eyes, the wrong people.
and there's an interesting, you said it kind of permeated every level of society and all these institutions. But I was struck, Theodore Roosevelt, you mentioned, was obviously a conservationist as well. And Madison Grant, as you said, the racist writer, he's known in the Bronx also is a founder of the Bronx, one of the founders of the Bronx Zoo.
Yes.
So it's a
Yeah, he also was
very
big
shocking.
in saving the trees in California. He was a conservationist, and the thing about eugenics, it really ran parallel with movements of the time. In this case, anti-immigration. They fed off each other. They gained legitimacy off each other. You could see the anti-immigration movement wanting to use a quote science to solidify their racist beliefs, and you could also see how eugenicists would want to borrow off the fervor of the anti-immigration movement. And that happened with birth control, with vision, with all of these movements of the time. And they just kind of bounced off each other eugenics was kind of a vessel like that, but it was kind of standalone as well. I see another two questions there.
Here we go. Sandy, please type your question. And Joan Lowenthal asks, can you comment on the connection between eugenics and the Great Replacement conspiracy theory today?
Well, eugenics alone, what is certainly proven to be a social philosophy. And although the quote science or the pseudoscience has been debunked, it's really hard to kill a theory in philosophy. You can call things many different names if it fits your model and what you'd want to do. If the idea of suggesting that whites or anyone is being replaced by others, that just again fear mongering, trying to create a fervor to really affect others, and that's where the danger lies. Because when you have these kind of public statements and from leading officials like ruining the blood of the nation, and you're whipping up that hate, and it's a really dangerous situation to be in, whether it was 100 years ago or this week. It's just a matter of what will be used for the time. And that's really what it was. It's just another philosophy. I mean, even in its name, the replacement theory alone, um, you know, the melting pot, that's what we've been or should have been. So, um, those kinds of things get eroded when we have this ugly rhetoric.
Pete Ortiz says, "Hi, Mark. Not a question, but just wants to thank you for this astonishing information. Definitely picking this book up."
Thank you,
Uh,
Pete. Good seeing you. Thank you for joining. Yeah.
Francie comments, Jeffrey Epstein and fascinating with eugenics. Please comment.
I don't know. Well, look, I don't know if Jeffrey Epstein was fascinated with eugenics. Again, eugenics was tried. It was really used as a vessel for. Um, if that question is suggesting that Epstein was, whether it's based on race or a reproduction or anything, I can't comment on that. But again, it was a convenient way to use someone to use to foster their own ideas and agendas. It really served as that template. But again, it also had its own self-sustaining movement in and of itself. So eugenics was really, and that, by the way, would explain why it was bipartisan. There was no left or right here. Everybody bought in on this. It was one of those unique, rare circumstances where the country rallied around it, regardless of politics. And that was very unique in and of itself.
On that ranch he had in New Mexico, I haven't read it in a long time, but Epstein's ranch, they said that he was interested in producing like so-called, this kind of perverted thinking, perfect human beings.
Yeah.
But
And the irony,
I haven't read it in quite a long time.
and the irony of that is they talk about these self-contained areas where they're not mixing of bad bloods, but we know now that bottlenecking of genes is one of the worst things you could do. So again, it's really fostered on that us versus them mentality that's kind of been prevalent throughout our times.
Uh, Joan Lowenthal asks, how do we best combat these ideas when we encounter them?
Well, I think education, awareness are the first two biggest things, and that's largely why I've written this book to share. And also, the idea of the localities, right? But many of these books, all of these books, talk about eugenics on a global perspective, as they should. But I wanted to bring it down and tell it from the local perspective where it started, and then how it branched out from local to national to international. And I think it all starts with education, learning, awareness, and ultimately comes down to being tolerant. The title Station of Intolerance. That's really what this was. It was a movement of intolerance based on hate, racism, prejudice, economic arguments. Why are we caring for the sick and the poor? Why are my tax dollars paying for that? Those kind of intolerances really made for a dangerous situation. So certainly education and awareness are the best way to start, and then continue further discourse.
Did you ever come across anyone that was a eugenicist having doubts or having kind of
Yeah,
skepticism
absolutely.
that what if this happens to me or something in that vein?
Well, no, there were two excellent examples. Thomas Hunt Morgan. He was one of the early leaders of the eugenicist program. He studied fruit flies at Columbia University. Now, fruit flies reproduce every 10 days, so they could study and study and study. And he realized this is not working. We can't track what we think we can track in human beings. So he realized that early on that the science was flawed. He asked for his name to be removed from the letterhead of the eugenics records groups, but he went away obscure, into obscurity, but he never denounced it. And Henry Goddard himself, who actually prepared and specialized in these diagnoses and the IQ test, later regretted what he had done. All too little, too late. None of them really spoke out openly at the time. There was one man, a scientist named Franz Boas, who was a fervent a critic of Davenport in the program, but it was in the minority. By then, it was already too ingrained, and any outside complaints was just marginalized quickly.
Francie says, July 31st, 2019, the New York Times, deep reporting on Epstein and eugenics. Thank you, Francie. Dante Bruno says, hi, great presentation. He
Thank you.
grew up by the Kings Park Psychiatric Center. Do you have any information on the institution?
Yeah, they spent a lot of time at Kings Park. Again, full access to the records. It was one of the largest facilities, and not far. I mean, not far from Cold Spring Harbor. I'd say less than 50 miles, and that gave them a lot of access to the data and the records and the reports. But it didn't stop there. They would, and also I'll add that I guess the inclination often is to suggest race, and it was certainly race, but it wasn't just race. They were indiscriminate. Where that Laughlin would send reporters up to search for the shiftless whites of the South, up in Ulster County, the families living up there that they would study as well. And to them, it was a lot about class, of course, the poor classes, disabled and lack of education and disability and disease and hardships that they used to exploit. And those were the ones they deemed were bringing us all down, or were bringing them down, I should say. And that was their fears.
Sandy Walker, you can ask Mark now. Just type your question out in
Hey,
the
Sandy.
chat. Um, and Petretti says, very powerful. Thank you, Mark. Francie says, transhumanism is the modern translation of eugenics, and that is what Epstein espoused. Angel Martinez says, thanks for the history lesson, and we'll pick up the book.
Thank you, brother.
And Dante Bruno says, my dad was a doctor there. We grew up on the grounds of the Kings Park Center. Dante Bruno also asks, Vassar is my alma mater. Were there any prominent figures from there? I suppose that he needs to involved in the eugenics movement.
Sure. Many of the colleges had, at the very least, a course on eugenics. It was often mixed with biology, with farming, like Cornell. They would have animal husbandry and farming and eugenics. It really was practiced in almost 300 colleges across the United States. And, obviously we can look back now and perhaps sit in judgment, but again, it was really the rage of the age, and many of the leading thinkers of the time espoused this and believed in this. And it would stand the chance that the layperson would follow suit. Without access to the information, although today's times we have access to good information, but also misinformation, and that could be in and of itself troubling. But back then, they didn't have the access to the mass data that we have now. So a lot of it was the fear mongering. It was very effective, and again, by the leading people of the time.
Okay. Dante Bruno says, can't wait to read the book. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Sandy, you can talk now if you'd like to ask your question.
Hey, Sandy.
Okay.
Hi. I have two questions actually for you, Mark. I know the study covered the Long Island Indian reservations.
Yes.
However, did they find any or study any of the Indians that were in the hospitals or the poorhouse? Did you run across anyone off reservation?
Yeah, I didn't find them specific as Native American, but certainly if they were there, they were studied, Sandy, and
Okay.
it wasn't just the local reservations; it was across the country,
Yeah, well, I
Midwest.
thought you might have run into some specific ones. And my other question, you might not be able to answer right now, but I'd love to talk to you about it further.
Sure.
is Charles Davenport in 1910. He really began to lead the Cold Spring Harbor facility,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Do you think genetics had anything to do or an impact on the 1910 Montauk case? And did Davenport have any connection to the lawyers and the judges involved in the case?
Well, our dearly departed John Strong, who just passed away, as we both,
Mm-hmm.
Sandy and I, know very well, he theorized this, and I tend to agree. I think that eugenics it certainly influenced local, national, international policies. And if you're reading those reports, it almost seemed and it wasn't really published, but it was completed with photographs, very extensive 80-page report. It was tailor made for that kind of presentation to influence the policy of how the Native Americans were going to be treated at the time. So I don't have specific information, but I have no doubt that their influence was there at the time. Because remember, although the Eugenics Record Office opened in 1910, the idea started earlier, 1902, when Clement
Yes.
Galton, that 8-year gap, it was the burgeoning science, and the thinkers of the time were desperate for this new kind of cutting edge science, and they thought they had it with eugenics.
Well, let's talk about that further one day.
Absolutely, Sandy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Okay, anyone else have any questions for Mark? Francie, yes. Okay, no one has any questions? Francie has a question. Okay, Francie.
Yeah, thanks. Mark, have you ever been to Cold Spring Harbor?
Yes, I have. And I'll tell you a funny story, Francie. When I started my research and I made the appointment to go there, I had no idea what to expect. I was generally spooked. I told my wife, if something happens to me, you know where I am. We know where to find me, if you will. And then when I got there, I was immediately, laughing at myself. It was a wonderful campus, international renowned work in genetics and other science they perform. Beautiful facility, very courteous and professional, and very helpful. And you know, like the Nazis, the Geneticists kept meticulous records, records of everything. Davenport would he was a counter. He counted everything down to the pencils and the smallest of items they'd use, and all these expense reports. And really, he felt, and he did have to answer to the Carnegies and the Harrimans, the funders of the time. So all the records, or many of the records, were there. And certainly, if you see the cover of the book, you see the background of Cold Spring Harbor, at that setting. So yes, I was there and been there several times. Plan to still go there with further research.
Oh, good, because Mark, ironically, the Nazis also are and were legendary for their maintenance of records,
Yes,
and the exquisite, horrific detail
yes,
many of those records contain. But in any event, the reason I asked Mark if you had ever been to Cold Spring Harbor is because I trust you might agree, quite apart from the specifics that enticed you to visit there for your research, it's really a magnificent patch of earth. And
absolutely.
it is really occupied by the 1%.
Yeah, it's very lucrative. Very. Can you imagine now? Now, Mary Harriman donated 80 acres of land there. Can you imagine an unfathomable cost that would be today? Very rich, very beautiful, wonderful area. And look, even going back to the early Native Americans who were there, they understood the lush land, the deep harbor, everything involved in it. It's really is a beautiful facility, area, campus, facility as well. And I want to make clear for those in the audience, the eugenics program is gone. There is no eugenics lab there anymore. And many, one of the things I've been questioned, and I question myself on, is I don't seek to really bastardize an area. I write about Long Island history. I love Long Island, but sometimes, the information told may seem like it's talking negatively. It's not about the place. It's about the people who did things at that place. And that's why I always question myself and my readers to understand.
Yeah, and Mark, it's precisely, I believe, the features of the terrain there, as you rightfully describe, that made it so attractive
Yes.
because there was such a disconnect. On the one hand, it was very remote, which made it out of sight, out of mind.
Yes.
And then on the other hand, when you juxtapose the horrific intention
Yes.
and engagement there against the lush beauty
Yes.
of the lay of the land, it's
Well,
really mind-blowing.
yeah, and I'll add that they almost chose Woods Hole, Massachusetts for the setting, but Davenport resisted because Woods Hole was way too remote. And obviously Cold Spring Harbor, with its proximity to New York City and lucrative funding, it was right there. And that's a large reason why they had done it. And I'll also add, without sharing too much, that the actual Eugenics Record Office building, which I early on thought was torn down, it's not torn down. It's still there. It's a private home. I won't share the address. It's a private home, and I respect the people who live there. But the building itself is still there. It's a home, and it's a beautiful place. And obviously you can't blame the current occupants for that past history, and I'm sure they're aware of the history. And again, it's a very lucrative, rich, beautiful area to be. And
and also the one time research home of James Watson,
Mhm.
who also lost his chair for, I think, having racist views. So interesting
Yes, yeah,
connection
Watson's.
there.
I'm often asked that, and Watson's controversy came well after my work, and it's almost like a part two, if you will, but I don't think it's in scope. But yeah, that's certainly, when you have a cutting edge facility, like Brookhaven National Labs in Long Island, these facilities do cutting edge science, and sometimes shrouded in mystery, sometimes we tend to think the worst, and maybe rightfully so, but other times doing magnificent work in the name of science. So certainly there.
Okay, Kathleen Sheenan wants to know, Mark, did you have access to the records when you did
Yes.
work?
Yes, I had access. What happened was, Kathy, and thank you for joining, Kathy. I hope say hi to Bruce as well. One of the things that they had, after the ERO closed, they dispatched and sent many of the records outward. Some of it stayed in Cold Spring Harbor. Some went to Philadelphia, the American Philosophical Society. Some went to Kirkland, Missouri, and some went to Minnesota. They just wanted to kind of get it out there, various bastions of Carnegie Institute influence. And the records, by and large, a lot of them are still really well preserved. Admittedly, reading some of those old letters with the old cursive handwriting was incredibly hard. But a lot of the records are there, and they're just very, very important and priceless for research and study.
She also asked, were any of these records destroyed, but you seem to say no.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I believe probably a lot of the index cards, the early, they went out and got these cards and pedigree information. A lot of those were likely destroyed, of course. But a majority, I would not put a percentage on how much was saved and how much was destroyed. What I can say is there's more than ample enough information out there, certainly for me and others to have written about this topic.
Dante Bruno says, I did several genetics programs at Cold Spring Harbor in high school, chilling with this information. And Grace Dawson asks, wondering if the Illinois school milk and fresh aid program spread to other states. My mother attended school in Manhattan in the 1930s and the 1940s and told of similar programs, skinny kids grouped in classroom windows,
Yeah.
And special milk given to students who are thought to be prone for TB.
Yeah.
And she says, P.S. Your book and research, top-notch work.
Thank you, Grace, and say hello to the family. If we've seen it one place, it likely was at many others. And again, if the idea was, even if subtly, to get rid of those who are bringing the what they felt was the perfect race down, it certainly likely did happen at many other locations.
Aiko Saki says, 2 weeks ago, I visited Pro College in the Bronx. Now I'm back in Japan, but I'm very happy that I could attend this meeting online and listen to the lecture in real time. I hope events like this will continue to be available online in the future. I would love to keep joining from Japan.
Yeah,
Yes, the best part about this job is some of the people you meet. You would probably
absolutely
never meet in any other job.
No, absolutely,
It's
and
very
not only
interesting.
and thank you for sharing that, and best of your travels there. And I look, this was an international phenomenon. I hope I'm working with some people to try to coordinate a visit next year to Switzerland. I know in Europe there's a very big understanding and disdain for eugenics and a legacy, and my goal is to share it wherever somebody will have me, and as long as I have the means and the time, I'll be honored to go and share this history where it started in our backyard.
All right, I think that think that is it. Thank you very much, Mark, for a very interesting talk. And this will be posted on our YouTube channel. So we'll send it out to the people that signed up, and also keep a close eye on our website. We have many interesting events coming up, including an exhibit opening on April 24th at the Valentine Variant House on heavy music in the Bronx. Should be very interesting. All right, take care, and thank you, Mark, again for very chilling and
Thank you all.
Be
Thank
well.
you all for attending tonight. Have a great evening.